Officer Danny Morris walked down the busy street on that cool October evening with his eyes scanning everything around him. He had been a cop in Chicago for 15 years and believed he could spot trouble from a mile away. The downtown shopping area was filled with expensive stores and well-dressed people carrying shopping bags. Danny noticed a tall black man walking slowly past the store windows with his hands in his pockets. The man wore a simple black jacket, blue jeans, and white sneakers. Nothing about his clothes seemed expensive except for a watch on his wrist that caught the light from the street lamps. Danny felt something in his gut telling him this man did not belong here. He had seen many criminals in his career, and this person fit a pattern he recognized. Danny called out loudly across the sidewalk. The man turned around slowly and looked at Danny with calm eyes that showed no fear or surprise. He appeared to be in his late 30s with short hair and a strong build. His face remained neutral as he waited for Danny to speak again. Danny walked closer with his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. People on the street started to slow down and watch what was happening. Some of them already had their phones out. Danny demanded to know what the man was doing in this neighborhood. The man answered in a calm voice that he was just walking, and that walking was not illegal. His tone was polite but firm. Danny felt annoyed by the response. He did not like it when people talked back to him, especially in front of witnesses. He told the man he needed to see identification right away. The man did not move immediately, which made Danny even more angry. Danny repeated his command louder this time. The man said he was happy to cooperate but wanted to know what reasonable suspicion Danny had for stopping him. By now, more than a dozen people had gathered around them. Several were recording the interaction on their phones. Danny could feel his authority being challenged in public, and his face grew hot with anger. He raised his voice and said the man was in an area with recent break-ins and was looking at stores while wearing expensive items he probably could not afford. That was his reasonable suspicion. A woman in the crowd made a shocked sound. Someone else said quietly that this was wrong. The man's expression did not change much, but something flickered in his eyes. Maybe it was disappointment, or maybe just tiredness from dealing with situations like this before. He said he had every right to be there, and his identification was in his wallet in his back pocket. He would reach for it slowly. Danny told him to keep his hands visible. His own hand moved closer to his gun. The man raised his hand slightly, then moved very carefully to take out a black leather wallet from his back pocket. He held it out toward Danny, who grabbed it quickly from his hand. Danny opened the wallet expecting to see a normal driver's license. What he found instead made him pause for a moment. The identification card looked different from any he had seen before. It had official government seals, special holograms that changed color in the light, and a clearance level printed on it that made his stomach feel strange. Danny read the name out loud. Dr. Marcus Webb. The card said Department of something, but Danny could not understand all the abbreviations and codes printed on it. He asked what this card meant. Marcus answered quietly that the information was classified and his presence in the area was also classified. He would appreciate getting his identification back so he could continue with his evening. Danny's mind was racing, but his pride would not let him back down. Not with all these people watching and recording everything. He said he did not care what kind of fancy card Marcus had. He still needed to verify it was real. Marcus let out a long breath. He asked if Danny's name was Morris by reading his name tag. He said Danny was making a big mistake and asked him as a courtesy to end this interaction now. Danny felt insulted. He asked if Marcus was threatening him. His voice went even louder. Marcus said no. He was trying to save Danny from professional embarrassment. But if Danny insisted on continuing, Marcus would have no choice but to make a phone call. Danny laughed in a harsh way. He told Marcus to go ahead and call whoever he wanted. His lawyer, probably. Danny said he had dealt with plenty of lawyers before and was not worried. Marcus pulled out a phone from his jacket pocket. Danny immediately went on high alert and told him to put it away. "Put it down now." Marcus said calmly that he was simply making a phone call as he had stated. Danny had not arrested him or charged him with anything. He was within his rights to use his phone. The crowd had grown even larger now. People were standing on both sides of the street watching. Someone shouted to let him make the call. Another voice added that this was racial profiling. Danny felt everything spinning out of his control, but his ego would not allow him to step back. He told Marcus, "Fine, make the call." It would not make any difference. Marcus pressed a single button on his phone and raised it to his ear. The call connected almost instantly, which seemed strange. Marcus spoke clearly into the phone, giving his name and an authorization code with letters and numbers. He said he needed someone to contact Chicago Police Department Downtown Precinct immediately. He was being detained by Officer Daniel Morris with a specific badge number. Yes, that was correct. No, he was not hurt, just detained. The officer was refusing to end the interaction despite proper identification. He said thank you and lowered the phone. Marcus looked at Danny and said someone would be calling the precinct in about 90 seconds. Danny might want to keep his radio on. Danny made a scoffing sound and said whatever game Marcus was playing would not work. But even as the words left his mouth, his radio crackled with static and a voice came through. The dispatcher said, "All units, this is dispatch," and called for Officer Morris by badge number to respond immediately. Danny grabbed his radio from his belt, feeling confused and slightly worried. He pressed the button and said this was Morris. He asked what was going on. The dispatcher's voice came back immediately, telling him he needed to return to the precinct right away. Captain Rodriguez wanted to see him now. Danny looked at the crowd of people still recording him with their phones. He told the dispatcher he was in the middle of a stop and could not leave yet. The dispatcher's voice changed to a tone Danny had never heard before. It sounded urgent and almost frightened. She said, "Officer Morris, you are ordered to disengage from your current situation and return immediately. This is a direct order from the captain. Do you understand?" Danny stared at Marcus, who simply raised one eyebrow and said nothing. The people in the crowd were murmuring to each other. Some were whispering about what they had just witnessed. Others were already typing on their phones, probably posting the videos online. Danny felt sweat forming on his forehead even though the evening air was cool. He pressed the radio button again and said acknowledged. He looked at Marcus one more time, trying to understand what had just happened. Marcus remained calm and composed, like someone who was used to being in control of difficult situations. Danny wanted to say something, but no words came out. He turned and walked back toward his patrol car, feeling dozens of eyes watching him. The walk felt longer than it should have. His legs felt heavy and his mind was spinning with questions. As he drove back to the precinct, Danny tried to make sense of everything. The identification card had looked real, too real actually. The seals and holograms were not something a person could fake easily. And the phone call had connected so fast, almost like it was a direct line to someone important. Then there was the immediate response from dispatch. Someone with serious authority had contacted the precinct within seconds of Marcus making that call. Danny's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, as worry started to replace his earlier confidence. When he arrived at the precinct, the desk sergeant gave him a strange look and told him to go straight to Captain Rodriguez's office. Danny walked down the familiar hallway, but everything felt different now. Other officers watched him pass, but no one said anything. He reached the captain's office and knocked on the door. A voice told him to enter. Captain Sofia Rodriguez sat behind her desk with her face showing no emotion. Danny had known her for years and had never seen her look this serious. But what made his stomach drop were the two other people in the room. A woman stood near the window wearing a dark suit with a federal badge clipped to her belt. Next to her was a man in a military uniform with the rank insignia of a colonel on his shoulders. Both of them turned to look at Danny when he entered. Rodriguez told him to sit down. Her voice was cold and flat. Danny sat in the chair across from her desk, feeling like he was shrinking. Rodriguez asked if he had any idea what he had just done. Danny tried to explain that he was doing his job and investigating suspicious behavior in a high-theft area. The words sounded weak even to his own ears. The woman in the suit stepped forward and introduced herself as Agent Lisa Hamilton from the Department of Defense. She said the man Danny had detained tonight, Dr. Marcus Webb, was one of the most important scientists in the United States government, possibly in the world. Danny felt his mouth go dry. He said Marcus had not mentioned anything about being a scientist. Agent Hamilton's eyes went cold. She said he should not have to mention it. He showed Danny his identification, which Danny apparently did not bother to examine properly. If he had looked carefully, he would have seen that Marcus held a level 5 security clearance, which was higher than most generals. Higher than the colonel standing in this room. Danny tried to defend himself, saying he thought the card might be fake. The colonel spoke for the first time. His voice was hard and angry. He said Agent Hamilton was being generous. The identification Marcus carried was issued by the highest levels of the Department of Defense. It had security features that were impossible to counterfeit. Any competent officer should have recognized it immediately, or at minimum called it in for verification before continuing the detention. Agent Hamilton pulled out a tablet computer and tapped on the screen. She began reading facts about Marcus Webb. He had graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at age 19, with 2 degrees in physics and engineering. By 25, he had earned his doctorate and published research papers that changed how scientists understood propulsion systems. He currently headed the Advanced Technologies Division at the Pentagon's main research facility. She paused and looked at Danny with obvious contempt in her eyes. She said 3 years ago, Marcus led the team that developed quantum shield technology currently protecting the naval fleet from hypersonic missiles. Last year, his work on energy distribution systems saved an estimated 10,000 lives when a solar flare almost knocked out the entire eastern power grid. He was personally responsible for keeping America ahead of China and Russia in scientific fields that Agent Hamilton was not authorized to discuss with someone at Danny's level. Danny felt sick to his stomach. He said quietly that he did not know any of this. Rodriguez leaned forward across her desk. She asked why he did not know. Because he did not ask questions. Because he did not look at the identification card properly. Because he made assumptions based only on what Marcus looked like. The colonel added more information. He said Marcus was also a decorated military veteran. He had served as a combat engineer in the Marines before returning to civilian research work. He had earned a Bronze Star Medal and 2 Purple Hearts for injuries received in combat. Danny's face had gone completely pale. He felt like the room was spinning. Rodriguez said she had been reviewing Danny's record. This was not the first complaint about racial profiling. It was just the first one that had made it this far up the chain of command because Danny had picked the wrong person to harass. Agent Hamilton tapped her tablet again. She said the interaction had been recorded by 17 different civilians. It had already been uploaded to social media and was spreading rapidly across the internet. The hashtag was trending nationally. News vans were setting up outside the precinct building at this very moment. The colonel spoke again with anger clear in his voice. He said Marcus could press serious charges against Danny. Violation of civil rights, unlawful detention, and harassment. Given Marcus's security clearance and the nature of his work, there were also national security implications to consider. Danny had delayed Marcus from attending a classified briefing that was scheduled for that evening. The briefing involved matters of national security that the colonel could not discuss, but were extremely important. Danny felt like he could not breathe properly. He asked what would happen now. His voice came out weak and shaky. Rodriguez stood up from her chair. She said Danny was suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. Internal Affairs would be conducting interviews with everyone involved. He needed to surrender his badge and weapon right now. Danny started to protest, but Rodriguez cut him off. She said she was not finished talking. Marcus would be completely within his rights to sue both Danny personally and the entire police department. The city would lose that lawsuit and it would cost taxpayers millions of dollars. Danny's actions had potentially embarrassed the Chicago Police Department on a national stage in front of the whole country. Hamilton added that Marcus was currently in a conference call with the Secretary of Defense and the Mayor of Chicago. They were discussing what steps to take next. The fact that such high-ranking officials were involved showed how serious this situation was. Danny slumped down in his chair. 15 years of service on the police force, potentially destroyed in one encounter that lasted less than 10 minutes. But even now, part of him wanted to justify what he had done. He started to say how was he supposed to know Marcus was important? The man looked like any other person walking down the street. Rodriguez cut him off sharply. She asked what he meant by that. Looked like what exactly? Like a black man walking in a nice neighborhood. That was not probable cause. That was not suspicious behavior. That was racism, plain and simple. There was no other word for it. Danny had profiled someone based entirely on the color of their skin, and then escalated the situation when his authority was questioned. The room fell silent. Danny could hear the clock on the wall ticking. He could hear voices in the hallway outside. He felt smaller than he had ever felt in his entire life. Rodriguez told him to stand up. Danny stood on shaky legs. She held out her hand. Danny unclipped his badge from his belt and placed it in her palm. Then he removed his service weapon from its holster and handed that over too. The weight of the gun leaving his side felt like losing a part of himself. Rodriguez told him to go home. Do not talk to the media. Do not talk to anyone about this case except his union representative and the internal affairs investigators. Do not leave the city. He would be notified when the investigation hearings would begin. Danny nodded and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Agent Hamilton spoke one more time. She said Danny should understand that Marcus Webb had devoted his entire adult life to protecting people. Protecting Americans, protecting people like Danny and his family, and this was how Danny had repaid that service. Danny left the office and walked through the precinct with his head down. Every officer he passed seemed to know what had happened. Some looked at him with disappointment. Others looked angry. A few looked sympathetic, but no one spoke to him. He got in his personal car and drove home in a daze. When he arrived at his small apartment, he sat in the darkness for a long time just thinking about everything that had happened. He finally turned on his phone, which he had silenced hours ago. It immediately started buzzing with notifications, text messages from other officers, missed calls from numbers he did not recognize. He opened his social media and saw he was being mentioned thousands of times. The videos were everywhere. People were sharing them with comments about police brutality and racial profiling. His name was public now. People were angry. Danny watched one of the videos. He saw himself approaching Marcus. He heard his own voice demanding identification. He watched himself grab Marcus's wallet. He saw the aggressive posture of his body, the hand near his weapon, the raised voice. He looked at Marcus's face in the video, calm and patient even while being harassed. Danny barely recognized himself. The person in that video looked angry and mean. The person in that video looked like a bully with a badge. He spent the rest of the night reading comments and watching different angles of the same incident. Some people defended him, saying he was just doing his job, but most people were condemning his actions. Civil rights organizations were calling for him to be fired. Legal experts were discussing the case on news programs. And through it all, people kept mentioning who Marcus really was. A hero, a genius. A man who had done more for his country than most people could imagine. The next morning, Danny woke up after only a few hours of sleep. His phone was still buzzing constantly. He turned on the television and saw his own face on the news. The reporter was standing outside the precinct explaining what had happened. Then the screen changed to show an interview. It was Marcus sitting in a professional studio across from a well-known journalist named Patricia Lane. Danny sat up and turned the volume higher. Patricia asked Marcus why he had not immediately told Danny who he was and what he did for a living. That information could have ended the interaction right away. Marcus's face was thoughtful as he answered. He said he should not have to be an important scientist or a military veteran for his rights to be respected. Every person, regardless of their job or status, deserves to be treated with dignity. The problem was not that Danny did not know who Marcus was. The problem was that Danny made assumptions about Marcus based on the color of his skin. Patricia asked if he had experienced situations like this before. Marcus said more times than he could count. He had been stopped by security guards at his own research facility where he worked every day. He had been followed by store employees when shopping. He had people assume he was a delivery person when he arrived at important meetings in his own building. This was not new or unusual. It was just the first time it had been so publicly documented with so many cameras recording. The interviewer asked what Marcus would say to Danny if he was watching. Marcus looked directly at the camera. Danny felt like those calm, intelligent eyes could see right through the television screen into his living room. Marcus said Danny needed to understand that every interaction he had with the public carried enormous weight and responsibility. People trusted police officers with great power, and that power had to be used with wisdom and fairness, not prejudice and assumptions. Marcus also said Danny's actions had not just harmed him personally. They had harmed the police department, the other officers who did their jobs with integrity, and the community's trust in law enforcement. Patricia leaned forward and asked about the calls for Danny to be fired from the police force. What was Marcus's position on that? Marcus took a moment before answering. He said that decision was not his to make. He was not interested in destroying someone's career out of revenge or anger, but there had to be accountability for what happened. If Danny kept his job, he would need extensive retraining. He needed to understand deeply why his actions were wrong, and frankly, Marcus said, Danny needed to examine his own biases and prejudices that led to this situation. Danny turned off the television. He sat in silence, staring at the blank screen. Everything Marcus said was true, and that made it worse somehow. Danny had expected anger or demands for punishment. Instead, Marcus had been measured and fair even while criticizing him. That calm dignity made Danny feel even more ashamed of his own behavior. Over the next few days, the story continued to dominate news coverage. More details emerged about Marcus's work and accomplishments. A newspaper published a long article about his life. He had grown up in a poor neighborhood in Detroit. His mother worked 2 jobs to support him and his younger sister. Teachers recognized his exceptional intelligence early and helped him get scholarships. He excelled at every level of education. After his military service, where he was injured twice saving fellow soldiers, he dedicated himself to scientific research that would protect others. The article included quotes from colleagues and former professors. They all described Marcus as brilliant, humble, and deeply committed to using his knowledge to help people. One former Marine who served with him said Marcus had carried a wounded soldier through enemy fire for 2 miles to reach medical help. Another scientist said Marcus often worked 18-hour days because he felt personally responsible for keeping America safe from emerging threats. Danny read every article. He watched every interview. He learned about the scholarship fund Marcus had created for minority students pursuing science degrees. He learned about Marcus volunteering at community centers teaching kids about engineering. He learned that Marcus had turned down lucrative private sector jobs that would have made him wealthy because he believed his skills were needed in public service. The contrast between Marcus's life of service and Danny's moment of prejudice became clearer every day. Danny had spent 15 years as a police officer and could not point to a single accomplishment that compared to what Marcus did regularly. And yet Danny had treated him like a criminal based on nothing but appearance. The internal affairs investigation began 2 weeks after the incident. Danny sat in a small windowless room answering questions from 2 investigators. They asked about his training. They asked about department policies on stops and searches. They asked about previous complaints against him. Danny answered honestly because lying would only make things worse. The investigators showed him his record. There had been 12 complaints about racial profiling over his career. All had been dismissed or resulted in minor reprimands. Danny had always believed those complaints were unjustified, people trying to get out of legitimate stops. Now looking at the pattern, he saw something different. He saw himself repeatedly stopping people of color in situations where he probably would have ignored a white person. One investigator asked Danny directly if he was racist. Danny wanted to say no immediately. He wanted to defend himself and explain he had friends of different races. But he stopped and really thought about the question. Was he racist? He did not burn crosses or use slurs, but he had made assumptions about people based on skin color. He had treated people differently because of how they looked. He had let fear and stereotypes guide his decisions instead of facts and evidence. Maybe he was racist in ways he had never wanted to admit. Danny said quietly that he was starting to think maybe he was, not in obvious ways but in subtle ways that were almost worse because he had not recognized them. The investigators wrote notes. They said his honesty was noted but did not indicate whether it would help him. The investigation took 6 weeks. During that time, Danny was not allowed to work. He stayed in his apartment mostly, watching the world continue without him. His friends from the force stopped calling after the first week. His family was disappointed, though they tried to hide it. His father, a retired officer himself, told Danny he had brought shame on the badge. Danny started attending the mandatory counseling sessions required by the department. The counselor, a woman named Dr. Helen Grant, did not judge him but made him confront uncomfortable truths. She asked about his childhood, his training, his experiences on the force. Slowly, Danny began to see how he had developed his biases over years of exposure to certain ideas and influences. News coverage of the incident eventually decreased as other stories took over the headlines. But the internet never forgot. The videos remained online with millions of views. Danny's name would forever be associated with this incident. When future employers searched for him, this would be the first thing they found. Then came the official decision. Captain Rodriguez called Danny to her office. The room was different this time. Just her behind the desk, no federal agents or military officers. She looked tired. Rodriguez said the investigation had concluded. The findings were that Danny had violated department policy on multiple counts. He had conducted a stop without proper reasonable suspicion. He had escalated the situation unnecessarily. He had failed to properly verify identification. He had allowed personal bias to influence his professional judgment. Danny waited for her to say he was fired. Rodriguez continued. She said the department had considered all options including termination. However, given Danny's previously clean record aside from the complaints, and given that Marcus had specifically stated he did not want Danny's career destroyed, they were offering an alternative. Danny would be suspended without pay for 6 months. He would be required to complete extensive bias training and sensitivity courses. He would be demoted from patrol officer to desk duty. He would be on probation for 2 years, during which any similar complaint would result in immediate termination. And he would issue a public apology. Danny felt relief and shame at the same time. He was keeping his job, but at a huge cost. He asked if he had a choice. Rodriguez said yes, he could refuse the offer and face termination instead. But she recommended he accept. Danny said he would accept. Rodriguez told him the training would begin next week, and he should prepare for it to be difficult and uncomfortable. The training facility was in a building downtown that Danny had driven past hundreds of times, but never entered. On the first day, he walked into a classroom where 12 other officers sat waiting. They were all there for similar reasons. Officers who had complaints or incidents involving bias or excessive force. Some looked angry to be there. Others looked embarrassed like Danny felt. The instructor stood at the front of the room organizing materials. His name was Gregory Phillips, and he was a retired police officer who had spent the last decade helping reform departments across the country. He was an older black man with gray hair and a calm, authoritative presence. Gregory started the session by saying he knew none of them wanted to be there. He understood they felt defensive or attacked. But if they were willing to listen and honestly examine themselves, they might learn something valuable. The first thing Gregory did was play video clips from their incidents. Danny watched himself confront Marcus again. Seeing it on the big screen in front of other people was even more painful than watching alone at home. Gregory paused the video at certain moments. He asked Danny what he was thinking at each point. What made him approach Marcus in the first place? What did he see that registered as suspicious? Danny struggled to answer. He said Marcus looked out of place. Gregory asked him to define out of place. Danny realized he could not give a good answer that did not involve race. A person walking down a public sidewalk looking at stores was not inherently suspicious. Gregory asked the other officers in the room what they saw in the video. Some admitted they might have done the same thing Danny did. Others said they would not have approached without more specific suspicious behavior. Gregory explained that human brains look for patterns to make quick decisions. This helped ancestors survive by recognizing threats quickly. But modern society was complex, and those quick pattern-matching instincts often led to bias. When someone repeatedly saw news stories or heard colleagues talk about crime in certain communities, their brain started associating race with danger. This happened unconsciously. Good training and self-awareness could counteract these instincts, but it required constant effort. Over the following days, Gregory showed statistics about policing. He showed how officers stopped people of color at much higher rates than white people, even though contraband was found less frequently. He showed how use of force was more common in stops of minorities. He showed how these patterns existed even in departments where most officers believed they were fair and unbiased. The numbers did not lie even when individual intentions seemed good. Danny learned about implicit bias tests that measured unconscious associations. He took several tests and the results troubled him. He showed strong implicit bias associating black faces with danger and white faces with safety. This bias existed despite his conscious belief that all people should be treated equally. Gregory explained this was common and did not make someone irredeemably racist. But it did mean extra care was needed to avoid letting those unconscious biases influence actions. The training covered the history of policing in America. Danny learned things he had never been taught in the academy. He learned about slave patrols in the South that were precursors to modern police. He learned about laws specifically designed to criminalize black behavior after slavery ended. He learned about redlining and how it created the segregated neighborhoods that still existed today. He learned about the war on drugs and how it disproportionately targeted minority communities. Despite similar drug use rates across races, all of this history created systems and patterns that still influenced policing today. Officers like Danny inherited these patterns without realizing it. They learned from older officers who learned from their predecessors. Biases were passed down through generations of police culture. Breaking these patterns required acknowledging they existed in the first place. Gregory brought in guest speakers. One was a young black man named Kevin who shared his experiences being stopped by police. He had been stopped over 30 times in his life starting when he was 16. Most stops were for minor reasons or no reason at all. Walking at night, driving in a nice neighborhood, sitting in a parked car. Each stop was frightening because Kevin never knew if the officer would be reasonable or aggressive. He never knew if a simple encounter might escalate into violence. Kevin described the exhaustion of constantly being viewed with suspicion. He had to dress carefully, speak carefully, move carefully because any mistake might be interpreted as threatening. He was a college graduate working as an accountant, but still got followed in stores. Still got nervous when he saw police cars. Still had to have the talk with his younger brother about how to survive police encounters. Danny listened and felt shame burn in his chest. He had never thought about how his stops affected people beyond the immediate interaction. He had never considered the cumulative weight of being stopped repeatedly for no good reason. He had never thought about the fear and anger that built up over years of this treatment. Kevin was articulate and intelligent, but Danny wondered how many times officers had assumed he was dangerous just like Danny had assumed about Marcus. Another speaker was a white woman named Linda who talked about her awakening to racial issues. She had grown up believing racism was mostly solved. Then her daughter married a black man, and Linda watched how differently her son-in-law was treated in everyday situations. Store employees watching him closely, people crossing the street to avoid him, police stopping him for minor traffic violations her white sons never got stopped for. Linda described feeling shocked and guilty that she had been blind to these realities for so long. Gregory then focused on practical skills for the officers. How to recognize when bias might be influencing a decision, how to slow down and think before acting on instinct, how to treat every encounter with genuine respect regardless of how the person looked, how to build trust with communities that had been harmed by biased policing. These were concrete tools they could use on the job. Danny absorbed everything, but the most powerful moment came when Gregory showed the rest of the video from Danny's incident with Marcus. The part that had not been widely shared online. After Danny left, Marcus had stood on the sidewalk surrounded by concerned citizens. Someone asked if he was okay. Marcus said he was fine and thanked everyone for recording what happened. Then he asked people to remain calm and not let anger lead to more problems. He said most police officers were good people trying to do a hard job. The problem was systems and training, not individual evil. Watching Marcus defend police officers even after what Danny had done to him was overwhelming. Marcus had every reason to be angry, to demand harsh punishment, to paint all officers with the same brush Danny had used on him. Instead, he showed grace and understanding. He recognized complexity and tried to move toward solutions rather than just revenge. Danny realized this was true character, not how someone acted when things were easy, but how they acted when they had been wronged. Gregory paused the video and asked Danny what he felt watching that. Danny's voice was rough when he answered. He said he felt unworthy of that grace. He felt Marcus was a better man than Danny would ever be. Gregory nodded and said that feeling was the beginning of real change. Not feeling sorry for yourself, but recognizing the gap between who you are and who you could be, then doing the work to close that gap. The training lasted 6 weeks total. Each day, Danny learned more and felt worse about his past behavior. But Gregory kept emphasizing this was not about shame for its own sake. It was about transformation. Shame that led nowhere was useless. Shame that motivated change was valuable. Danny needed to take what he learned and become a different kind of officer. Near the end of the training, Gregory assigned homework. Each officer had to research someone they had wrongly judged or mistreated. Really learn about that person's life and what they contributed to the world. Danny chose Marcus, though several other officers picked the same person. Danny went beyond the news articles and interviews. He found Marcus's published research papers, though he could barely understand the complex physics and mathematics. He found mentions of Marcus in military records and commendations. He found a video of Marcus speaking at a high school career day encouraging kids to pursue science. Danny discovered that Marcus's younger sister had died in a car accident when Marcus was in college. Marcus had used the insurance money meant for his education to pay for her funeral and help his mother. He took a year off school to work and save money before returning. That detail was not in any major article, but Danny found it in an old local newspaper archive. It showed Marcus's character in a way that made Danny's throat tight with emotion. Marcus had faced hardships and discrimination his whole life, but responded by trying to help others. He could have become bitter or angry, but instead channeled everything into positive contribution. Danny thought about his own response to much smaller challenges. When his authority was questioned, he got angry. When his ego was bruised, he lashed out. Marcus had been harassed and humiliated publicly, but responded with dignity and calls for understanding. Danny wrote a 10-page paper about what he learned. Gregory read it and asked Danny what he planned to do with this knowledge. Danny said he wanted to apologize to Marcus directly. Gregory asked if that was for Marcus's benefit or Danny's own need to feel better. Danny thought carefully. He said maybe both, but mostly because Marcus deserved to hear a real apology face-to-face, not through lawyers or media statements. Gregory said that was acceptable if Danny was prepared for Marcus to reject the apology. Forgiveness could not be demanded, only offered. After completing the training program, Danny returned to work on desk duty. He filed reports, answered phones, helped citizens who came in with questions. It was boring compared to patrol, but Danny tried to do it well. His fellow officers treated him differently now. Some avoided him. Others made comments about him being the guy from the video. A few were sympathetic in private but would not show it publicly. Danny started volunteering for additional community outreach programs. The department had several initiatives trying to build better relationships with minority neighborhoods. Most officers avoided these assignments because they were time-consuming and sometimes uncomfortable. Danny requested them. He attended community meetings and listened to residents share their experiences with police. Many of the stories were similar to what Kevin had shared in training. People being stopped repeatedly, being treated with suspicion in their own neighborhoods, having their children harassed by officers who assumed the worst. Danny listened without defending himself or other officers. He acknowledged the harm and asked what could be done better. Some people appreciated his presence and willingness to listen. Others were angry and told him listening was not enough. They wanted systemic change, not individual officers feeling bad. Danny accepted that criticism. He started working with a community group that reviewed police procedures and made recommendations for reform. He also started speaking at the police academy to new recruits. He told them his story without sugarcoating his mistakes. He showed them the video of his encounter with Marcus. He explained how his biases and ego led to a terrible decision that hurt an innocent man and damaged public trust. He told them they would face similar moments in their careers, moments where instinct and bias pulled one direction while fairness and justice pulled another. The kind of officer they became would be determined by which direction they chose. Some recruits seemed to really hear what he was saying. Others looked skeptical or bored. Danny understood you could not reach everyone, but if even a few officers learned from his mistake and made better choices, it was worth the embarrassment of sharing his failure publicly. 6 months after the incident, Danny worked up the courage to do what he had been planning. He found out that Marcus volunteered at a community center on Saturday afternoons teaching science to teenagers. Danny drove to the center and waited outside until the session ended. He watched through the window as Marcus worked with a group of kids on a robotics project. Marcus was patient and encouraging. He made the complex concepts accessible. The kids were engaged and excited. Several were black and brown kids from the neighborhood who probably had few opportunities to work with advanced technology. When the session ended, the teenagers filed out laughing and talking about their projects. A few gave Danny curious looks as they passed. Then Marcus came out carrying a box of equipment. He stopped when he saw Danny standing on the sidewalk. Marcus's expression was neutral but guarded. He did not look afraid or angry, just careful. Danny's prepared speech evaporated from his mind. He said Marcus's name, then stopped. Marcus waited with his arms crossed over his chest. Danny tried again. He said he knew he was probably the last person Marcus wanted to see. He would not take much time. He just needed to say something in person. Marcus did not walk away, so Danny continued. He said he was sorry, not just for that night, but for every assumption he had made, and every time he had let his prejudices guide his actions instead of his training and conscience. He had spent 6 months trying to understand how he became the person in that video. He still did not have a complete answer, but he was trying to become better. Marcus studied Danny for a long moment before asking why he was telling him this. Danny said because Marcus deserved an apology from day one and Danny had been too proud and stubborn to give it. And because he wanted Marcus to know that what happened that night had changed him fundamentally. Danny could not undo what he did, but he could make sure he never did it again. He could try to help other officers avoid making the same mistakes. Marcus was quiet. Danny could see him thinking, weighing whether Danny's words were sincere or just an attempt to make himself feel better. Finally, Marcus said that words were easy. Actions were what mattered. Danny nodded and said he understood. That was why he was also volunteering with programs that connected police officers with community members. He was working with the department to improve bias training. He was speaking at the academy about what happened and what he learned from it. It was not enough and would never be enough, but it was what he could do. Marcus's posture relaxed slightly. He said he appreciated Danny coming here. He would not say he forgave Danny, not yet. Forgiveness took time and required seeing sustained change, not just words and promises, but he acknowledged the apology and Danny's apparent efforts to improve. That was more than many people in Marcus's position would offer, and Danny knew it. Marcus then said something that Danny had not expected. He asked if Danny understood the real harm his actions had caused. Not just to Marcus personally, but to the broader community. Danny started to answer, but Marcus held up a hand. He said when officers like Danny profiled people based on race, it sent a message that certain people were less valuable, less deserving of respect. It told black children they would always be seen as suspects first and citizens second. It told parents they had to give their kids terrifying talks about how to survive police encounters. It created a barrier between law enforcement and the communities that most needed good policing. Marcus continued explaining that he had the resources and connections to fight back when he was mistreated. He had a high-level security clearance and powerful people who would listen to him. But most people who experienced what he experienced that night had none of those advantages. They just had to endure the humiliation and hope it did not escalate to violence. Some of them died because an officer made the same assumptions Danny had made, but the interaction went differently. Every officer who engaged in biased policing made it more likely that the next encounter would end tragically. Danny listened, feeling the weight of Marcus's words. He had thought about his mistake in terms of this one incident with this one person. He had not fully considered how his pattern of behavior over 15 years had contributed to a larger problem that destroyed lives and communities. Marcus was asking him to see the bigger picture, to understand that changing himself was necessary but not sufficient. The entire system needed to change. Marcus asked what Danny planned to do with that understanding. Danny admitted he did not have a complete answer. He was just one officer with limited influence, but he could speak up when he saw other officers engaging in the same behavior he used to practice. He could support policy reforms even when his fellow officers resisted them. He could be honest about the problems in policing rather than defending everything out of loyalty to the profession. It might not seem like much, but it was what he could offer. Marcus nodded slowly. He said that actually was significant. Police reform always failed when officers closed ranks and refused to acknowledge problems. Change required people inside the system willing to challenge it. Danny would face resistance and hostility from colleagues who saw him as a traitor. But if he could endure that and keep pushing for improvement, he might actually make a difference. Then Marcus did something Danny did not expect. He extended his hand. Danny stared at it for a moment before shaking it. Marcus's grip was firm and his eyes looked directly into Danny's. He said Danny should not waste this second chance. A lot of people did not get one. Their lives were destroyed or ended by officers who never faced consequences or learned from their mistakes. Danny had been given an opportunity to be better, and he owed it to all those people to make the most of it. Danny promised he would. They released the handshake and stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Marcus said he needed to get the equipment back inside before the next group arrived. Danny thanked him for his time and for his grace. Marcus just nodded and turned to go back into the community center. Danny watched him disappear through the doors, then walked back to his car feeling both lighter and heavier than before. The apology had not fixed everything. Marcus had not said he forgave Danny, or that they were okay now, but he had listened and acknowledged Danny's efforts. That was more than Danny had any right to expect. Now he had to prove through sustained action that his transformation was real and lasting. Over the next year, Danny continued his work trying to reform policing from within. He joined a task force reviewing use of force policies. He pushed for better training on de-escalation and implicit bias. He testified in favor of measures that would increase accountability for officer misconduct. This made him unpopular with many fellow officers who saw him as betraying the brotherhood. Some officers called him a sellout. Others said he was only doing this to save his own career. A few made threats that his life would be difficult if he kept speaking out. Danny endured it because Marcus had been right. Change required people inside the system willing to challenge it. Danny had spent 15 years being part of the problem. He could spend the rest of his career trying to be part of the solution. He also maintained his community outreach work. He attended neighborhood meetings and listened to residents. He helped organize youth programs that brought kids and officers together in positive ways. He volunteered as a mentor for young people who had negative views of police. It was slow, difficult work with no guaranteed results. But gradually some relationships improved. Some people who had refused to even speak to officers started to engage. Some kids who had been taught to fear police began to see them as potential allies. Danny knew his efforts were a drop in the ocean compared to the scale of the problems. Systemic racism and biased policing existed far beyond what one reformed officer could address. But he kept working because it was all he could do. He had caused harm, and now he had to spend his life trying to balance that harm with whatever good he could create. 2 years after the incident, Danny received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end identified himself as someone from Marcus's office. Danny's heart sank, thinking maybe Marcus had decided to pursue legal action after all. But the caller explained that Marcus was organizing a conference on police and community relations. He wanted Danny to participate on a panel discussing officer transformation and accountability. Would Danny be interested? Danny asked why Marcus would want him involved. The caller said Marcus believed in redemption and second chances. He thought Danny's story could be powerful if shared in the right context. The conference would bring together police officials, community leaders, activists, and researchers. It was an opportunity to have honest conversations about difficult topics. Danny said yes immediately. The conference was held in a hotel downtown 3 months later. Danny arrived early feeling nervous. The agenda showed multiple panels over 2 days covering topics like implicit bias, use of force, community policing, and accountability measures. Danny's panel was titled From Harm to Healing and included 2 other former officers who had gone through similar transformations. Marcus gave the opening speech to an audience of several hundred people. He talked about his own experiences with biased policing throughout his life. He explained how these experiences had shaped him but not broken him. He emphasized that police were necessary, and that most officers entered the profession wanting to help people. The problem was inadequate training, toxic culture, and systems that rewarded aggressive enforcement over community service. Change was possible but required honesty about the problems and commitment to solutions even when they were uncomfortable. During Danny's panel, he told his story to the assembled group. He showed the video that had changed his life. He explained his thought process that night and how wrong it had been. He described the training and self-examination that followed. He was honest about how hard it was to face his own prejudices and how much resistance he faced from fellow officers when he tried to advocate for change. Several people in the audience asked challenging questions about whether he had really changed or was just performing contrition. Danny answered as honestly as he could. He said he struggled with his biases every day. Change was not a switch you flipped, but a constant effort to be better than your instincts and conditioning. After the panel, Marcus approached Danny during a break. They shook hands and Marcus asked how things were going. Danny said he was still on desk duty and probably would be for the foreseeable future. He was okay with that. He had also started working on a degree in social work, taking night classes. He thought maybe when he eventually left the police force he could work directly with communities in a different capacity. Marcus said that sounded like a good path. They talked for a few minutes about the conference and the various perspectives being shared. Marcus mentioned he was disappointed more police leadership had not attended. Danny said change was slow in law enforcement culture. Many officials saw events like this as attacks on police rather than opportunities for improvement. But slowly, very slowly, some were starting to listen. The work Marcus and others were doing was making a difference, even if it did not always feel that way. Before they parted, Marcus said something that stuck with Danny. He said the greatest harm from that night was not what happened to Marcus personally. He had moved on. and his life had not been significantly affected. The greatest harm was in reinforcing for others that this was how the world worked, that black people would always be seen as threats, that authority would always triumph over dignity, that speaking up against injustice was pointless. Marcus said what helped counter that harm was showing the aftermath, showing that sometimes accountability happened, sometimes people changed, sometimes the system responded even if imperfectly. That gave people hope that progress was possible. Danny understood. His transformation and the consequences he faced were not just about him. They were part of a larger narrative about whether justice existed and whether people could grow beyond their worst moments. That put additional weight on his shoulders. He could not just be quietly better. He had to visibly demonstrate change to show others it was possible. Several months after the conference, Danny was working his desk shift when a young black officer named Chris approached him. Chris was new to the force and had seen Danny speak at the academy during his training. He said he appreciated Danny's honesty and wanted advice. Chris had experienced racism from some senior officers who made comments about him not belonging, or questioned whether he had earned his position. Chris was struggling with how to handle it without damaging his career. Danny listened and felt ashamed that the problems he had been part of still persisted. He told Chris the truth. That speaking up was risky and could make his professional life harder, but staying silent allowed the toxic culture to continue. Danny suggested Chris document everything and consider filing formal complaints. He also offered to support Chris if he needed someone to corroborate issues or speak on his behalf. Chris seemed relieved to have someone listen and take him seriously. That conversation led to Danny becoming an informal mentor for several younger officers who were trying to practice community-focused policing in a department that often resisted it. Danny shared what he had learned about checking your biases, de-escalating situations, and treating every person with dignity. He also warned them about the pushback they would face and how to navigate it without compromising their principles. 3 years after the incident, Danny's probation period ended. Captain Rodriguez called him in for a review. She said his record had been exemplary since his return. He had completed all required training. He had contributed to community outreach programs beyond what was required. He had helped mentor younger officers. She was lifting his probation and offering him a position in the community relations unit if he wanted it. It would mean taking a significant pay cut compared to patrol, but would align with the work he had been doing voluntarily. Danny accepted without hesitation. The new position meant coordinating between the police department and community organizations. He helped organize town halls, participated in neighborhood watch programs, and served as a liaison for residents with concerns about policing. It was not glamorous work, and he spent a lot of time in meetings listening to people's frustrations. But it felt meaningful in a way patrol never had. He still faced skepticism from community members who knew his history. Some people refused to work with him because they did not trust that his transformation was genuine. Danny accepted that. He knew trust had to be earned over time through consistent action. He showed up, did the work, and let his efforts speak for themselves. One evening, Danny was leaving the community center after a meeting when he ran into Marcus again. Marcus was there for his regular Saturday volunteer session. They had not spoken in over a year, though Danny had followed Marcus's continued work in the news. Marcus had recently received a national award for his scientific contributions and had used his acceptance speech to call for more investment in education and opportunity for disadvantaged communities. They talked briefly about their respective work. Marcus seemed pleased with Danny's continued efforts. Danny mentioned he was finishing his social work degree and hoped to transition fully into community service within a few years. Marcus said that would be a valuable contribution and wished him well. As they prepared to go their separate ways, Marcus paused and said something that surprised Danny. He said he forgave him. Danny had not expected that. He asked what changed. Marcus said time and observation. He had watched Danny sustain his commitment to change over years, not just months. He had seen Danny face consequences and criticism without retreating into defensiveness or self-pity. That demonstrated genuine transformation, not just performance. Marcus still thought what Danny did was wrong and harmful, but he believed Danny had done the work to become a better person. That deserved acknowledgement. Danny felt emotion tighten his throat. He thanked Marcus and said that forgiveness meant more than Marcus probably realized. Marcus smiled slightly and said he understood. Then he added that forgiveness did not erase the past or remove responsibility. Danny still had to carry the weight of what he had done and continue working to balance it. But forgiveness meant Marcus no longer held anger about it and hoped Danny would keep moving forward in a positive direction. They shook hands and parted ways. Danny sat in his car for a while, processing what had happened. He had spent 3 years working toward this moment without knowing if it would ever come. The relief was profound, but so was the understanding that the work was not finished. Marcus was right that forgiveness did not erase responsibility. Danny would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the second chance he had been given, not because he expected reward or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Because every person deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of how they looked. Because the badge he once wore had been meant to protect everyone, not profile them. These were lessons he had learned the hardest way possible, taught by a man who had every reason to destroy him, but chose instead to hope he could be better.